Hi, I'm Roger Jenks from Grace Institute, and welcome to Time Out. We have a special guest today. We have Geoff Mitchell, who is the senior pastor at Big Life Community Church in Oswego, Illinois. The reason we've invited Geoff to be our guest this month is because we're going to talk to Geoff about the things that he has learned being a new church planter that are transferable to churches of all kinds. He has actually been a senior pastor at a traditional church, fairly large church, and then he's done this new church plant that started about a year and a half ago, right? And he's learned some things and has experimented with things, and it's kind of an ongoing experiment, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And one of the things I wanted to find out to start with is, what are some of the big things that you thought through before you even tried to do this, that you thought, we've got to get this kind of figured out, at least to start? What were some of those?
One of the big things we had to sort out as we started the church was, why does God want this church here? And that might sound overly theological to get things going, but I think the church is started by God, and God is the reason that the church exists. So we have had to go back to asking ourselves, why does God want this church here? What are the things that we want to see people believe about God and experience about God in their lives? The other thing that we've had to think about in terms of big picture is, who are the people that we're trying to reach?
I was just going to ask you about that.
Who lives in our community? Who doesn't live in our community? What kind of churches are already here? Are we doing a carbon copy of what the church down the street is doing? And so being able to not only ask, why does God want this church here, but then be able to ask, who are the people that God has put around this church? Those two things start to merge together in a big picture way to shape almost everything that we do.
And in a lot of ways, those are the same kind of questions that any kind of church really ought to be thinking about, especially if they're rethinking what they're supposed to be trying to do. One of the big things that you do, obviously, is you preach, every week. How do you, this is a different kind of church. How is it different preaching at this church, and what went into your decision making about how you preach? I know you tend to preach sermon series. Tell me, how you go through that.
Again, I have to take serious who's right in front of me. It's not people that have been going to church for 40 years. It's not people that have been going to the same church for 40 years. So I have kind of had to dial back and think, if they only get 15 minutes of faith in the whole week, what is it that is essential that I communicate to them? So I have tried to put it into real bite-sized, digestible pieces of the Christian faith in a clear, simple, and memorable way. And you do that through, my experience has been, take one thing and talk about it for 5 weeks. Because I know this is going to be a shock for us both, Roger, but people don't remember everything from our sermon.
Really?
They don't. I know, it's a hard truth for us to deal with. But, you can take a big theme, and boil it down into digestible pieces. And maybe one week you talk about the biblical underpinnings of stewardship or faith sharing or prayer. One week you just do 15 minutes of pure application. This is how you pray. This is how you give. This is how you invite. And then you use other biblical examples to tie it together and use creative ways to make it more than just how to pray 101. And so sermon series have allowed us to take one big idea and stretch it out over a series of time to where it really sinks in, not only into the hearts of the people, but in many ways the vocabulary of the people when they talk about what their faith means to them.
And you presume that you don't have a high biblical literacy among the people who have arrived, I'm guessing.
I do not presume that, but even in traditional churches that I've served, it's false to assume that they have a high biblical knowledge, or even if they do know a lot of quote Bible. I think it's Neil Cole that says we are educated beyond our obedience. So just because they've heard the story doesn't mean they know what the story means to change their lives.
I remember somebody telling me once that even the supposed sophistication of an audience does not presume biblical literacy. You can be in a university community, and that doesn't mean that people know any more about the Bible.
No, it does not.
And I would assume that, like you said, traditional churches probably would benefit from thinking along those lines too. That series actually holds some things together.
It does. A series will hold together, maybe there's 4 or 5 things that your church really just needs to deal with in a year. You can almost duplicate a series without telling anybody by doing something in the spring on community outreach, and then turning around and doing something like that at Christmas and tying that together to the rhythms and the flows of what the culture and the church are already listening to and thinking about.
And the repetition is not a bad thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Let me change gears because away from the preaching for a little bit, because every pastor has to deal with the subject of pastoral care. I don't know what your habit was at the previous church you were at, which was more traditional, but in a new church setting like this, how does pastoral care happen and how much are you involved and how has that evolved?
In many ways, it's not different than what I tried to do at the large traditional congregation that I had served in Iowa, which was, I will be there for you, but more importantly, I hope that you experience that the church is there for you. Again, tragedy, I'll be present. If you give me a call, I'll probably respond. But the assumption that the pastor does everything to every whim and need of pastoral care has hurt the church, and we have the results to prove it.
Yeah.
And we have the clergy burnout to prove it.
Yeah.
So in my last church, you got visited every day in the hospital by somebody from the church. If you were in a hospital locally or where we live 90 miles away, someone would come visit you from the church. Now, I went to the hospital one day a week.
It wasn't always
me. No, I
Okay.
went one day a week. We had other staff that went. We had elders that were equipped to this. And then my favorite part of it was there was an embedded community that's not formal, but more important than the formal leadership, that knew how to make hospital calls, that knew how to send the meal over when so-and-so needed something to eat when their spouse was in the hospital. And that, until you have that embedded care and culture of care, it's easy to scold the pastor when they don't follow up, but that's really almost an indictment on the church more than it is the pastor.
Yeah, and the takeaway from that for a traditional church would be you're probably going to limit your growth if you put everything on the pastor. You're going to burn the pastor out, and you send a bad message to the congregation as well, that they're the only ones who can do it.
One of my favorite writers is Will Willimon,
Oh, yeah.
and he likes to say things that I believe but can't say. And he says, where does Jesus say that the health concerns of senior adults late in life is the primary reason the church exists?
Yeah.
And I kind of believe that, but at the same time, we care for people in need. We care for those that are hurting and those that are sick, and we pray for them. But at the same time, it's not the center of the gospel. It's not the center of the gospel.
Yeah. You do something really well that I want you to say something about, because frankly, it's something I think any church and any pastor probably would love to know how to do better, because I think it's at the heart of what we do. But you're really good at talking with people who are unchurched, do not know Christ, and you have this ability to talk them and help them across that threshold into making a commitment. Has that always been there?
It has not.
What's that all about? How do you do that?
It's one of those places in ministry where the things that I think of as a deficit finally help me. I'm a real introvert, and even to a detriment sometimes I'm a good listener. If you want to talk for 50 minutes, sometimes I'll just let you talk for 50 minutes. But being an introvert and listening to somebody talk for 50 minutes, the inevitability of the brokenness of life will come out.
It bubbles.
It bubbles up. You can go back and forth about how the Bears are doing or what's going on at the city council, but eventually that marriage is tough and raising kids is tough and debt is real, and that people have the capacity for sin in ways that we don't even want to acknowledge, let alone at church.
Yeah.
Over time that bubbles up. This is the beauty of the gospel. It is true in upscale suburbs, it is true for the desolate, it is true for everything else in between. And the gospel applies always in those situations of brokenness. And so when I build relationships with people, it's less of what I want to impose upon them and more about seeing where they have need. And the gospel always has a way of intersecting with that. So a real practical way of that. Most of my time when I spend with people is not at a church building, even though we don't have a church building, but it is at the local bar or at the local coffee shop or coaching youth sports, which is something I give a lot of time to. And it's in those almost indirect conversations that it all kind of comes out. Yeah. And I'm still naive enough to think that Jesus is the answer to broken people, including myself. And that is where the way I lay it out is, what are you going to trust more? Are you going to trust a God who is for you and loves you and forgives you? Or are you going to trust your habits of life, which have put you where you are and are only going to make it worse? Yeah. So I just like to give people permission to give up and give them permission to trust Christ.
Yeah. I think one of the nice things about that is probably a beneficial thing to anybody is the fact that it's less about knowing what to say than it is being willing to listen and then trust God to help people, that you don't convert anybody,
No,
do you?
no,
You know,
I
and
do not.
You trust God in that process. Another quick question, because I think we're running out of time a little bit. You get discouraged ever?
Yes, I do. I get discouraged. Yes, everyone in ministry gets discouraged.
Yeah.
If you don't think you're discouraged, or you say, "Oh, I never get discouraged," you're just not being honest with yourself, and in the end, you're really not being honest with God. And so, discouragement is real, and discouragement in mainline ministry is prevalent. You know, it is very real. The clergy burnout rate is through the roof.
Yeah.
You know, very few people have been able to do what you do, which is go to college, go to seminary, and serve faithfully for all of these years with a track record of very successful ministry.
Yeah, there's about 1,700 pastors that leave the ministry every month, which is just kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
And the reason I ask you about discouragement is because new church planting also has its scary statistics. About half of them never make it past 5 years.
Yeah.
You've got good traction going. You know,
Mhm.
you're only about a year and a half old. I guess what I'm asking is, it's been really hard. What's the hard stuff about church planting, and how is that different from traditional church? And how are they the same?
In a traditional church, I never had to worry if somebody was going to show up.
Yeah.
You know, we can complain about, oh, those people, they just come and do the same thing every week. Well, you know what? They do show up, and they do pay the bills.
That's right.
And they do, if you open the doors on Thursday night and say we're going to do something, somebody will show up.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes church planting different, because you could, and I've heard stories about this, and I've experienced this. You put all this advertising out there, you do all of these door hangers, you invite everybody and their cousin, and 3 people show up. And you have to go home that night and complain about it to your spouse and to God and beat yourself up. And so the discouragement is real in church planting, because whether you say it or not, whether you believe that whether you'll admit this or not, all your self-worth is tied up on what you create.
Yeah.
And we buy into the myth that we tell people not to believe, which is you're only worth what you can produce.
Yeah.
But nobody that tried to start a church got handed $300,000 and it closed 3 years later. They don't get invited to speak at the Willow Creek Leadership Summit. Nobody has. I did hear this is off topic. I did see a conference called Epic Fail that was
really?
a gathering of pastors who had burned out and failed, and what they thought they could learn from each other in that. And I thought, if we could just share a little bit more like that, rather than, I just started preaching out of 3 John and 10,000 people showed up. That doesn't happen. That doesn't
Very
happen.
rarely
Yeah,
does that
it does
happen.
not happen.
Well, how do you know? You've been in the pastorate for a while, so
Yeah.
this is not just okay. How do you survive in
Yeah.
a church plant?
Yeah.
How do you deal with the discouragement and the fatigue and the disappointments and things like that? What do you do?
In terms of the discouragement, I just have to keep reminding myself, I'm not what I produce.
Yeah.
Am I being faithful to God? Am I doing what God has asked me to do? And I do believe that if I'm doing what God will ask me to do, it will not result in my burnout.
Yeah.
You know, clergy burnout, I've gone through burnout in my life, but it was never from, I'm being faithful to what God's asked me to do, and I'm going to be obedient to Jesus every single day. And so when I get discouraged, I come back to, why am I here? Why did God send my wife and I here to start this church? And what is it that I'm supposed to do either this Sunday or this week in order to just, I'm a football guy, move the ball down the field a little bit more every day? How can I gain ground just a little bit? Deal with the honest setbacks, but know that I'm going to go back at it the next day, not because I'm strong, but because God's called me to do it. And that will inevitably fill me back up to go at it one more time.
And just because 3 people and a dog show up
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong.
No, it does
it's
not.
just a part of the animal.
Yeah, and it's a tough world we're doing ministry in.
How do you deal with the kind of the, how shall I put it, the fickleness of people? We have just a little bit of time
Yeah.
left, because things are changing in our culture.
They are. If somebody comes to church once a month, they consider themselves a regular attender.
Sure.
And so I just try to move with the movers. You know, who is God sending to the church? What is God doing in their lives? It's obvious. And then I pour my attention that way. I don't give a lot of focus, whether it was as a traditional pastor or even in a new church, to somebody that comes once a month and then either expresses a real need or, why don't you do this? And they're quick to point out what we should be doing, that kind of thing. It just doesn't get a lot of my attention. It just doesn't get a lot of my focus. my wife Marissa has this idea that we should have information from the other churches in the community in the back. So when they say, oh, your church should be more contemporary, traditional, charismatic, liberal, conservative, whatever, you know what? We've got all these options we would love to send you to.
Here's a folder.
Here's a folder. That's right. That's right. So that comes back to what we started with.
Yeah.
What is God doing in this church? Why does God want this church here? Who are we trying to reach? What are we called to do? And when we stay focused on that, it doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean the results just soar. But it does mean we can sleep a little better at night. Yeah. It does mean we can let people go out the door. Yeah. It does mean we can say this is who we are and who we're not.
And you have to make a decision to do that.
That's right.
Well, I wish we had more time, and maybe we'll have Geoff back at a future date because there's an awful lot here to talk about. And I hope you picked up that there's a lot of things that are transferable probably to your situation as well. When we get done with this video, there's going to be a slide on there that has contact information for Geoff if you have more questions that you would like to follow up with him. But we thank you for tuning in this month, and we hope that you got something to help your life through Time Out.